She thought she could steal the spotlight. She walked into the Capitol draped in elegance and wrapped in strategy, a former First Lady with a carefully sharpened smile and a speech designed to cut. With one glance, she dared Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to respond. She expected fire. She expected fury. What she didn't expect was a masterpiece. In the next few minutes, you'll witness a moment that never made it into the official press release, but made its way into classrooms, boardrooms, and hearts across America. A confrontation that wasn't about shouting louder, but about standing stronger. A response so precise, so devastatingly human, it didn't just silence a room. It reshaped the conversation about what power really looks like. And while this story is a dramatized account, inspired by very real figures and real emotions, its message is no less true. Because sometimes fiction is how we tell the truth, too big to fit in headlines. This is the story of what happened when one woman crossed a line and another chose not to scream, but to elevate. The rotunda of the United States Capitol never quite feels silent. Even in its quietest moments, it hums, with legacy, with tension, with the weight of unfinished promises echoing off its marble floor. That afternoon, the golden light of spring poured through the high domed ceiling like it had something holy to say. It shimmered off polished surfaces, danced over historic statues, and made the air feel almost reverent. Outside, cherry blossoms whispered in the wind. Inside, power whispered between people. This was supposed to be a celebration. The signing of the Leadership Through Learning Act, a rare bipartisan education bill months in the making. Republicans and Democrats alike had found common ground, or at least agreed on how to appear as though they had. The room was arranged with surgical symmetry, rows of white chairs lined up facing a grand podium, flanked by press risers already packed with reporters, clutching notepads and adjusting camera angles. From the outside, it looked perfect. But something was off. There was a tightness in the smiles, a pause in conversations when certain names were mentioned. A handful of Republican aides whispered too quickly, then scattered when a camera turned their way. On the Democratic side, glances exchanged beneath raised brows told their own stories, ones not meant for the press. And then, she walked in. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't arrive with an entourage. She didn't need one. She wore a plain white blazer, sharp creased but free of branding. No designer labels, no statement necklace, no borrowed power. Just presence. Quiet, potent presence. Her hair was tied back in a loose knot, a single strand tucked behind one ear with unconscious precision. She walked slowly, eyes scanning, not out of paranoia, but practice. The kind of gaze that saw everything but revealed nothing. She nodded politely to colleagues, smiled briefly at a staffer who had once been a student in one of her community programs. She made her way to the third row, aisle seat, and sat without rustling her papers. Her phone on silent pulsed once. She didn't check it. On her lap rested a thin, leather-bound notebook, its pages marked with tabs. Not random colors, strategic ones. Blue for bill amendments, yellow for quotes, red for rebuttals. A single silver pen clicked softly in her hand. Not writing, not yet, just ready. Across the room, a New York Times reporter squinted through her lens, muttering to a colleague, "Why does she look like she's waiting for cross-examination, not a photo op?" The aide beside her whispered, "Because she knows something." The Capitol had seen thousands of ceremonies. Most were predictably forgettable. Ribbons, signatures, applause, headlines fade to gray. But this day, something electric curled at the edges of formality, like the moment before a power outage or the second before thunder. It wasn't just the press who felt it. A junior senator, shifting in his seat, glanced nervously toward the east entrance. "Is she here yet?" he muttered. "She's coming," a senior aide said, "with notes and backup notes." Who was she? That wasn't a mystery. Everyone in the building knew. Melania Trump, former First Lady, publicly apolitical, privately calculated. Her attendance at a bipartisan education event had already stirred the media. But rumors of a speech rewrite, unapproved by her team, had set nerves ablaze. No one could confirm it. But something was coming. And the question hanging in the room, too heavy to speak out loud, was this: who was the target? AOC hadn't asked. She didn't need to. She had felt the shift in the air hours ago. That's why her hand hovered over the red tab section of her notes. Not out of fear, but precision. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in 9 minutes. In 9 minutes, the cameras would roll, the microphones would go live, the history books, or at least the Twitter threads, would start scribbling. And somewhere between the podium and the applause, a line was going to be crossed. She didn't know where, she didn't know how, but she knew one thing for sure. She would be ready. The hum of the rotunda grew louder in Alexandria's mind, even as the room itself remained outwardly calm. From the outside, she looked serene, posture composed, hands resting gently atop her notebook. But beneath that stillness was the unmistakable vibration of something quietly shifting. She felt it before she heard it. Her phone, face down and on silent, buzzed once against the leather armrest of her chair. Not the kind of buzz that announced a social ping, but the subtle, restrained vibration of her encrypted app, the one only a handful of trusted sources even knew existed. She glanced down, slowly turned the device over with 2 fingers, and tapped the screen. The message was short. No name, no punctuation, just 5 chilling words. Watch Melania. This isn't a speech, it's a setup. AOC didn't move. Not outwardly. Her face didn't tighten. Her shoulders didn't flinch. But her breath drew in slightly deeper than before, and held for half a beat longer. She stared at the message for a few seconds more, as if willing it to vanish, to morph into something less ominous, less familiar. But it didn't, and in truth, it didn't need to. She had seen this playbook before, not just in politics, but in every arena where power was more about shadows than spotlights. This was not the first time she had been warned. In the early days of her congressional term, she had received hundreds of threats, handwritten letters calling her a disgrace, anonymous voicemails filled with racial slurs, even doctored images showing her face behind prison bars or photoshopped beside weapons she'd never held. But the scariest ones were never loud. They were the ones that came just like this, minimal, calculated, surgical in their ambiguity. It's not a speech, it's a setup. A phrase like that didn't come from trolls or gossip hounds. It came from people who lived behind curtains, and whoever had sent it wanted her to know something was coming, but not enough to say it out loud. She tapped the screen again. The message disappeared into digital vapor. She wouldn't screenshot it, wouldn't forward it, wouldn't ask questions, because in Washington, the fastest way to get played was to ask too many questions too early. You didn't chase shadows. You stood still and let them fall across you. Without shifting her body, she let her left hand slide to the edge of the leather-bound notebook on her lap. It wasn't flashy, no monogram, no gold trim, just worn black leather with corners that had seen too many red-eye flights and committee hearings. She cracked it open silently. Inside, an array of color-coded tabs, each representing a scenario, a question, or a fact someone else had hoped she wouldn't remember. The red tab, labeled simply contingency response, was the one her fingers now brushed against. She flipped to it, slow and deliberate. First page, bullet points of key education policy arguments, indexed by speaker. Second page, anticipated media talking points tied to the bill and who might try to hijack them. Third page, a name, Melania Trump. Beside it, a list of quotes, appearances, rhetorical patterns, and 3 scribbled phrases underlined twice. Positioned as above the fray. Avoids direct confrontation, prefers moral superiority aesthetic. But when she strikes, it's never random. AOC's pen clicked softly. Her fingers were steady, but her mind was now fully active. Calculating, cross-referencing, remembering. She flipped to the back pocket of the notebook and pulled out a small card. It had only 4 words written in her own handwriting. Grace is not silence. She read it again, then tucked it back. She leaned slightly forward in her seat, but not enough to signal concern, just enough to refocus her attention. The room around her still buzzed, aides whispering, journalists checking white balance on their lenses, senators laughing at jokes only they understood. But Alexandria's mind was now a quiet war room. She was no longer waiting for the ceremony to begin. She was waiting for a moment to pivot. Somewhere, tucked into a speech, slipped between pleasantries, there was going to be a line, a deliberate one, a dangerous one. And when it came, she wouldn't flinch. She wouldn't fight. She would reflect, with clarity, with weight. Because grace wasn't silence, and she hadn't come to this room to clap. She had come, as always, to listen harder than anyone else and be ready when no one else was. The hush didn't happen all at once. It arrived in layers. First, a ripple in the back row, a brief pause in conversation, the instinctual shift of heads toward the rotunda's grand eastern archway. Then the sudden synchronized tilt of cameras on tripods, their operators adjusting lenses with quiet urgency. The ambient murmur of Capitol chatter dimmed, replaced by the unmistakable click, click, click of photographers locking into formation. She was here. Melania Trump entered not as a guest, but as a spectacle. Ivory dress, silk-gloved composure, and the kind of poise that suggested she hadn't walked in. She had arrived. Her steps were smooth, unhurried, deliberate, not fast enough to seem eager, not slow enough to seem unsure. Each movement calibrated for elegance. Not one strand of hair out of place, not one muscle of her face betraying a thought. Two aides flanked her, matching navy suits, earpieces tucked discreetly beneath perfectly brushed hair. One carried a leather folio with her embossed initials. The other scanned the room with the cool detachment of someone trained not to be surprised, though even he blinked longer than usual when he saw the front row of Democratic lawmakers subtly shifting their posture. Melania's gaze didn't wander. It swept. She acknowledged the press with a practiced half-smile, just enough to imply warmth, just restrained enough to avoid intimacy. If power had choreography, she was its lead dancer. And yet, in the third row, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez did not move. She did not glance up. She did not fidget or adjust her jacket. She simply remained. Stillness in a room vibrating with attention. Because what Melania didn't know, or perhaps had underestimated, was that the woman sitting silently just yards away had already mapped out this moment. Not the pageantry, not the angle of the cameras, but the shift in the room's chemistry. Alexandria had tracked it from the moment the message arrived. She didn't need to look to confirm what her body already sensed. Posture changes, breathing patterns, nervous energy cloaked in civility. Every signal had aligned. Now the target had entered the chamber, not with volume, but with intention. Melania turned slightly toward the crowd, offering a nod so precisely timed it could have been rehearsed. It probably was. Then their eyes met. Not dramatically, not directly, just briefly, like the brushing of two chess pieces across the same square. No smiles, no greetings, just calculation. Melania looked away first. Her aides guided her toward her designated seat in the second row, 2 places ahead of AOC. She lowered herself gently into the chair, crossing one leg over the other in an effortless motion that seemed more fashion editorial than political event. The aide to her left opened the folio on her lap. Inside, 2 copies of her prepared remarks, one typed and highlighted in soft yellow. The other scrawled with handwritten annotations, some lines underlined twice. AOC took all this in peripherally, not turning her head, not moving her body. Years of congressional hearings and field interviews had taught her how to observe without being observed. Her mind captured the small details, the aide's nervous swallow, the asymmetrical tilt of Melania's mouth suggesting restrained anticipation, the faint smudge of pencil on the left edge of the speech, meaning last-minute edits had been made in the car, or even in the hallway, which meant the speech had changed. Recently, something was about to happen. The Speaker of the House approached the podium. There was a momentary fumbling with the microphone, enough to break the tension for a heartbeat, and then a polite clearing of his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished colleagues, and honored guests," he began, his voice echoing across the chamber with a practiced cadence. "Thank you for joining us today for the ceremonial signing of the Leadership Through Learning Act." Applause followed, light even, but the room remained tightly wound, like a taut string waiting for the wrong note to snap it. Melania adjusted the folio on her lap. One of the aides whispered something into her ear. She nodded faintly, fingers brushing the corner of the page, eyes forward. AOC watched it all, not out of fear, not even curiosity, but focus, a deliberate, trained awareness. Because she didn't yet know the form the strike would take, but she knew it was coming. And when it did, it wouldn't be shouted. It would be slipped, between words like leadership and legacy, cloaked in pleasantries and applause. She took one breath, slow and quiet. 4 counts in, hold, 8 counts out, and waited, not to react, but to respond. The speaker's final words had barely faded when the room began to shift again, this time with coordinated ceremony. All eyes turned toward Melania Trump as she rose from her seat with the unhurried poise of someone who had done this many times before, even if she hadn't. Her movement was so precise, so devoid of hesitation, it seemed almost choreographed. Her ivory dress caught the light just so, like marble beneath stained glass. Cameras reoriented, microphones rose on cue. The chamber waited, not with excitement, but with expectation. She stepped toward the podium with slow, measured elegance. Every second felt rehearsed, every detail anticipated. Her folio, now closed neatly in her aide's hands, had served its purpose. What she needed was already committed to memory. She paused at the microphone, adjusting it with a practiced hand, and then looked up. Not at anyone in particular, but at everyone at once. The silence that met her was soft, respectful, and completely under her control. Then she began. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice warm, even melodic. "It is an honor to be here in this chamber again, among so many dedicated leaders, at a time when unity in purpose feels not only possible, but real." It was a strong opening, in tone, in rhythm, in message. Her words flowed effortlessly, echoing the bipartisan theme of the event. She praised the legislators on both sides who had worked to craft the bill, calling it a rare reminder that when we put our children first, party lines can fade into shared priorities. Applause followed. Light at first, then building. No one wanted to appear partisan during a celebration of progress. From her seat, AOC watched carefully. There was nothing in the former First Lady's cadence to suggest misdirection. Nothing sharp, nothing hidden. If anything, Melania's performance felt almost soft, nostalgic, like a return to the days when the East Wing's priorities were about wellness and restraint, not tweets and chaos. As many of you know, Melania continued, during my time as First Lady, I launched the Be Best initiative, a program centered around the emotional and social well-being of children. Today, I am proud to see so many of its values reflected in this bill. There it was, the callback, a rhetorical anchor, safely tethered to something non-controversial. The Be Best program had been mocked, misquoted, even forgotten by some, but Melania had always spoken of it with genuine pride. Here she wielded it not as a shield, but as a thread, weaving it neatly into the fabric of this new legislation. In the audience, shoulders lowered. Some lawmakers leaned back in their chairs, content to let the moment wash over them. Cameras panned across rows of half-smiles. Even journalists began typing more slowly, less like hunters tracking prey, more like scribes chronicling a benign success story. AOC narrowed her eyes just slightly. Her fingers rested lightly on her pen, which hadn't moved in minutes. Something about the way Melania delivered that last line, reflected in this bill, felt too smooth, too self-contained. But the tone was calming, the room relaxing, and even she found herself wondering, had the warning been wrong? She shifted in her seat, letting her left foot uncross and rest flat against the floor. The red tabbed notes in her notebook remained untouched. For a brief moment, doubt crept in. Maybe this wasn't what she thought. Maybe Melania was just playing it safe, rebuilding image, lending presence, nothing more. The former First Lady pressed onward, speaking of early childhood programs, school lunches, mental health access, the standard parade of safe, universal talking points. Our children are not political pawns, she said gently. They are our future. And we must protect not only their education, but their innocence. Another round of applause, this one longer. Cameras caught a Republican senator nodding vigorously. A Democratic representative smiled, carefully. AOC's lips parted slightly, not to speak, to breathe, to reset. She almost believed it. Almost. Then Melania turned a page in her mind, not the script, and looked up again. Her tone remained serene. Her smile stayed intact. But something had changed. AOC felt it before she could name it. A hardening around the corners of Melania's eyes. A shift in vocal emphasis. Not louder, just narrower, sharper. The next words came with an elegance so precise it almost masked the blade beneath them. Of course, Melania said, pausing delicately, for education policies to truly succeed, they must be implemented with clarity and strong leadership. She let the words hang, software almost flattering. But Alexandria's fingertips were already resting on her notebook. The warmth in the room was changing. She didn't know what was coming, only that now it had begun. The applause faded, polite and predictable, and for a moment it seemed the speech might descend back into ceremonial routine. But then Melania's tone changed, not suddenly, but with the slow, deliberate weight of a well-trained pianist lowering her fingers onto a darker chord. Her voice stayed gentle, but something beneath it had sharpened. A new edge, not loud, not angry, but unmistakably intentional. And yet, she said, pausing just long enough for the chamber to lean in, we must also be honest about the challenges we face, not just from outdated systems, but from loud voices that confuse disruption with progress. The words landed softly, elegantly, but they pierced. AOC's fingers froze above her pen. She didn't blink. The phrase was carefully chosen. Loud voices, disruption, confuse, all plausible, all deniable, but not accidental. Melania continued, her eyes glancing toward the far right of the room, then slowly drifting left, never resting directly on Alexandria, but grazing just close enough to feel deliberate. In recent years, she said, her smile steady, we've seen a rise in what I would call performative politics, where passion is mistaken for clarity, where shouting replaces strategy, where Twitter trends matter more than policy outcomes. A few soft chuckles rippled through the Republican seats. Some lawmakers shifted in their chairs, smirking behind their programs. Cameras zoomed in on faces, hungry for reaction. On the Democratic side, several expressions tightened, jaws clenched. A senator from Illinois lowered his chin and whispered something inaudible to the person beside him. AOC didn't move, but her spine, already straight, somehow seemed to align itself even more precisely. Her face was unreadable, but her mind was sprinting. She had heard attacks before, crude, obvious ones that swung wide and missed. But this wasn't that. This was something more refined, more dangerous. Too often, Melania said, we reward those who say the most provocative thing, not those who do the most meaningful work. We celebrate followers over facts, visibility over vision. More murmurs. One aide in the press gallery whispered, she's going there. Melania let the silence breathe for a moment. Then she softened again. Our children deserve better, she said. They need role models who embody maturity, not just attention. Leaders who govern, not just go viral. There it was, the line drawn, not in ink, but in implication. Melania hadn't mentioned AOC's name. She hadn't needed to. The architecture of her rhetoric did the pointing for her. The reference to Twitter, to virality, to performance politics, all of it unmistakably coded. She had wrapped the critique in velvet, but the knife underneath had gleamed, and the chamber knew it. In the third row, AOC lowered her eyes to her notebook, not to hide, but to anchor herself. She drew a small dash beside a quote in the margin, not to document Melania's words, but to mark the moment the mask began to slip. Melania, meanwhile, was smiling again. Perfectly. She spoke now of her personal journey as First Lady, how she had tried to stay above the noise, to model calm during chaos. She referenced family values, the importance of civil discourse, and the need for those in leadership to remember they are always being watched, especially by the young. Then casually, like a final drop of perfume, she added, "It is not enough to be visible. We must be valuable." A quiet exhale drifted across the room, some appreciative, others uneasy. The applause that followed was lighter, slower, but still respectful. But for Alexandria, it didn't matter. She had seen enough. This wasn't just a speech. It was, as warned, a setup. A delicately orchestrated rebuke cloaked in elegance and plausible deniability. And more than that, it was strategic. Melania had chosen this bill, this audience, this moment, not just to make a point, but to reshape a narrative. She wanted to remind the nation who was elegant, who was measured, who was dignified, and who, by contrast, was not. AOC let her pen fall softly to the page. She didn't write. Not yet. She simply thought, "So this is the line. You didn't cross it. You drew it around me." And if that was true, then the only question left was how to answer it. The final word of Melania's sentence, valuable, hadn't even fully echoed through the rotunda before the silence cracked. It began on the Republican side of the chamber, subtle at first, almost performative. A few soft chuckles, the rustling of suit sleeves brushing chairbacks as lawmakers leaned back, their posture loosening like spectators at a play where they already knew the ending. One congressman from Arizona, younger, ambitious, smirked visibly and whispered something to the aide beside him. The aide tried not to laugh but failed, covering it with a cough. The Democratic side remained frozen, not out of confusion, but out of calculation. Several members tightened their grips on their folders. One congresswoman crossed her arms tightly across her chest, her jaw shifting left, then right. Another exchanged a slow glance with a colleague 2 rows down. The unspoken language of allies, who'd been through these kinds of setups before. "We're being baited. Don't move first." The press gallery ignited like a row of fireworks. Phones lifted. Screens glowed. Thumbs blurred into motion. Tweets formed in real time. Did Melania just call out AOC without calling her out? Performative politics. Twitter fame. Ouch. Capitol crowd is stunned. Eyes definitely on AOC right now. AOC didn't move. Her fingers remained gently curled on the edge of her notebook, her breathing deep and regular. 4 counts in. Hold. 8 counts out. Her eyes stayed forward, not locked on Melania, but fixed just above the podium, as though studying the weight of the silence itself. She blinked once, slowly, calculating, sorting, noticing. Melania's speech hadn't ended, not quite. She was still rounding off her final paragraph, closing with the usual notes of unity and shared purpose. But it was all perfunctory now, hollow, like wallpaper covering a hole in the wall. Everyone knew the moment had already happened. The speech had split in two, what was written and what was truly delivered. As Melania finished, the applause came, not out of enthusiasm, but obligation. Some Republicans clapped first, hard and fast, like performers hitting their mark. Democrats joined in slowly, politely. Some barely touched their palms together, their eyes not even on the stage. 1 or 2 didn't clap at all. The Speaker of the House returned to the microphone with a carefully neutral expression, the kind worn by men who'd seen too many eruptions to be surprised by another. He cleared his throat. "Thank you, Mrs. Trump, for those thought-provoking remarks." Thought-provoking, the euphemism of the decade. AOC's aide, seated just behind her, leaned forward slightly. Before she could whisper anything, Alexandria tilted her head just an inch and spoke under her breath, her voice low and razor-sharp. "She didn't come to honor this bill," AOC said. "She came to bury someone in it." The aide froze. She knew better than to respond. Alexandria reached for her pen again. This time she clicked it. Once. A small sound, but in her hands it sounded like a starting gun. She flipped to the section marked with a red tab, the one labeled Contingency Response. She didn't read it. Not yet. She only touched it, like a pianist running her fingers across keys she might soon strike. And as the speaker began to transition the program, Next, we will hear from Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York. The room exhaled, but not in relief. It was anticipation now, not dread, not excitement. Something harder to define, something like inevitability. Every camera refocused. Journalists stopped tweeting and started recording. Lawmakers leaned forward, and AOC closed her notebook. Not sharply, not dramatically, just a slow, quiet press of the hand. The kind of gesture a person makes not to signal closure, but readiness. In the second row, Melania turned her head just enough to glimpse over her shoulder. Her expression was unreadable, but her posture, so regal minutes before, had shifted, not slumped, but stilled, as if she too understood. The moment had turned, and now it belonged to someone else. The speaker's voice rose above the fading applause, carefully modulated, as if he too sensed the tightrope the chamber was now walking. "And now," he said, scanning his notes, though he knew exactly who came next, "we will hear from Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York, who played a vital role in developing the equity provisions of this important legislation." The words were formal, the tone was neutral, but the atmosphere shifted the moment he said her name. There was no mistaking it. The applause that followed wasn't thunderous. It wasn't explosive. It was measured. Respectful, yes, but charged, like clapping for a volcano just before it erupts. Not because you want to see it blow, but because you can feel the mountain rumbling beneath your feet. The chamber was no longer clapping for a guest speaker. They were clapping because something irreversible had been set in motion, and instinct demanded they acknowledge it. AOC sat still for 1 second longer, letting the sound reach its awkward peak and begin to descend. Then, click. Her pen snapped shut in her fingers, the metallic sound sharp and clean. Not rushed, not theatrical, just final. She slid the pen into a slim slot inside her notebook, closed the leather cover, and pressed it flat with the palm of her hand. One breath in, hold, one breath out. And then she stood. There was no drama in the movement, no abruptness, no forced authority. She rose like she had done it 1,000 times, which in many ways she had. But today the stakes felt ancient. Like she wasn't just walking toward a podium, she was walking toward a reckoning. Every camera turned in unison, a mechanical ballet of shifting lenses and silent zooms. Even the aides stopped typing. Even the whispers stopped mid-sentence. Every heartbeat in the rotunda seemed to slow. Not stop. Slow, as if giving the moment more space to stretch out, to settle into the skin of everyone present. Alexandria stepped into the aisle. Her heels clicked softly against the marble, each footstep evenly timed. Not marching, not gliding, walking, with purpose, with control, with a presence that didn't demand attention, it commanded it. She didn't carry a folder, no stack of talking points, no speech clutched in her hand. The only thing she brought with her was herself, the kind of calm that isn't rehearsed but earned. As she passed the second row, Melania didn't turn, but AOC didn't need her to. The silence was deeper now, not absence of noise, but the weight of anticipation. People weren't just waiting to hear what Alexandria would say. They were waiting to see how she would say it. She reached the podium and stopped, placing both hands gently on either side. Her fingers didn't grip. They aligned, the same way she had aligned data, policy provisions, community stories, all of them stored in the mind of a woman who had long since learned that clarity beats spectacle. She didn't look directly at Melania, nor did she look away. She looked at the room, at everyone, from the press gallery to the lawmakers in the back row, from the aides holding phones to the older senators clutching armrests. She scanned the room with a gaze not of accusation, but of invitation. It said, "You may not agree, but you will listen." Her shoulders were square, but not rigid. Her chin lifted slightly, not in arrogance, but alignment. She centered herself in the microphone's arc. And then she spoke. Not loud, not rushed. Just 4 words, each one placed carefully on the air. "Thank you, Mr. Speaker." The room exhaled, slowly, silently, but the balance of energy had already shifted. The tension that had been building beneath Melania's elegance was now resting in Alexandria's stillness. The battle had begun, not with fire, but with form. Not a raised voice, not a shouted name, just the click of a pen and a woman standing with nothing in her hands except complete control of the room. The silence that followed Alexandria's greeting was different from the one that had preceded it. Before, the quiet had been laced with tension, a waiting game, an expectation of spectacle. But now the stillness felt attentive, willing. The entire room leaned forward, ever so slightly, drawn in not by noise but by intention. She let that moment stretch, not for effect, but for gravity. "I came here today," she began, her voice steady and unhurried, "to talk about classrooms, to speak about opportunity, equity, and the work this legislation represents for students across America, from the Bronx to Bakersfield." A nod from the back, murmurs of agreement, heads tilted, pens poised. "I came," she continued, "to talk about desks without enough textbooks, teachers buying supplies out of their own pockets, children who carry more burdens than backpacks, who show up anyway, hungry to learn, desperate to be seen." The sincerity in her voice wasn't performative. It was lived. And for a fleeting moment, the chamber seemed to reset, as if the political gamesmanship of the previous speech had been put on pause, and the room had been brought back to its original purpose. But then she pivoted, not sharply, not bitterly, just precisely. "But," she said, pausing just long enough for her next words to land cleanly, "silence in the face of distortion is complicity." A beat passed, then another. The room stiffened. Not theatrically, not in panic, but in realization. Alexandria's voice remained calm, almost gentle, but her gaze had sharpened. "We cannot champion education in one breath," she said, "and mock decency in the next. We cannot claim to stand for our children's future while dismantling the dignity of those guiding it." She opened her notebook, slowly, deliberately. Inside, only one page was visible, a sheet marked with 3 printed quotations. Not from opponents, not from critics, but from the very woman who had spoken moments earlier. "May 7th, 2018, Alexandria read aloud, her voice crisp, clear. "At the launch of the Be Best initiative, the former First Lady said, and I quote, 'We must choose to provide children with tools to cultivate their emotional health and model positive ways to communicate, both online and in everyday life.'" She looked up. No commentary, no sarcasm, just silence, heavy and instructive. October of that same year, she continued, turning the page, in an interview with ABC News, "We need to have more tolerance for different people with different beliefs. We must be more kind to each other and respect each other's backgrounds and opinions." A few Republican aides shifted in their seats. In the second row, Melania's hands remained folded on her lap, her face impassive, but her eyes no longer scanned the room. They were fixed straight ahead, unmoving. Alexandria kept going. "And April 2019, she said, now glancing down one final time, "I encourage everyone to be kind to each other and treat each other with respect in everyday life and on social media." She closed the notebook gently. No slam, no flair, just finality. "I bring up these words," she said, her tone softening slightly, "not to embarrass anyone, but because I believed them when they were spoken. I believed they were sincere. I believe that many in this room did too." Another pause. Not dramatic, but reverent. But words, especially from those who hold influence, are not decorations. They are not slogans to be shelved when inconvenient. They are commitments. And when we abandon them for applause or weaponize them against others, we don't just contradict ourselves. She let the weight build. One breath longer, 2 counts slower. "We teach our children that integrity is optional." There it was, not an accusation, not a viral clapback, a mirror, and she wasn't holding it up to one woman. She was holding it up to the whole room. And the room was staring back. The rotunda had grown impossibly still. Even the ambient hum of shifting bodies and clearing throats, the natural background noise of any congressional gathering, had disappeared. It was as if the very air had paused to listen, to consider the weight of what had just been said. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stood motionless at the podium, hands lightly resting on either side. Her notebook now closed once more, not as a shield but as a seal. She wasn't reading anymore. She was remembering and reminding. The words we heard earlier, she began again, voice low, measured, spoke of confusion, of immaturity, of visibility over value. Her eyes swept across the chamber, not accusatory, but encompassing. They were wrapped in civility, she continued, but aimed like arrows. She didn't need to say whose words they were. Everyone knew, and yet she never gave them the satisfaction of a name. Instead, she spoke again, softly, but with a resonance that landed deeper than volume ever could. But there were other words too, she said, words spoken in 2018, in 2019, words printed on press releases, posted on official White House letterhead, quoted in interviews played across classrooms, across screens, across dinner tables. She let the silence settle again. Respect each other, she recited. Another pause. Be kind online. The phrases, stripped of context, floated in the rotunda like echoes, as if they were being replayed from an old memory stored in the walls of the building itself. And in a way, they were, because everyone in that room had heard them before, when Melania had delivered them at podiums draped in official seals, standing beside children, educators, and dignitaries. AOC didn't add anything more. She didn't twist the meaning or deliver rebuttals. She just let them linger, like a chord that refuses to resolve. Finally, she spoke again, gently, like someone setting down a fragile truth for others to examine. Words don't vanish, she said. They echo. She paused, allowing that sentence to breathe, to expand beyond the podium. And when those echoes return, she continued, they reveal whether we meant what we said, or whether we were merely performing it. A slight shift rippled through the chamber, not dramatic, but visible. A Republican senator looked down at her lap. A Democratic lawmaker shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, but as if dislodging discomfort. In the press gallery, someone muttered, "That's the quote." Alexandria kept going, her tone unwavering. We don't get to choose which words define us. We don't get to cherry-pick from our past to craft a moment that flatters us while discarding the ones that bind us. Her hands remained on the podium. No gesturing, no dramatics. Leadership, she said, is not about eloquence. It's about consistency. Then her gaze, calm, direct, landed somewhere above the heads in the second row. Not at Melania, but in her direction. We all have contradictions, she said. We all have moments when our intentions fall short of our impact. But when we ignore those contradictions, when we bury them under new performances, we don't heal, we hollow. The weight of that word, hollow, rang out clearly. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. She leaned slightly forward, just enough to signal presence, not pressure. What we say, especially when cameras are on, becomes a record, not just of what we believe, but of what we want others to believe we believe. It was subtle, it was deliberate, and it was devastating. She drew one breath, as though bringing herself to a close, but instead she took one step further, softer still. And when children hear us speak, she said, they don't just absorb our policies. They absorb our tone, our timing, our contradictions. She looked out at the room, truly looked, eye to eye with people who weren't expecting to be called to account without being named. That's why I came here to speak plainly, she finished, not to defend myself, not to attack anyone, but to remind us all, including myself, that what we say matters, and what we say yesterday still matters today. Then came the final note, quiet, unshakable. Because words don't vanish. She lifted her gaze one last time. They echo. The air in the rotunda had grown thick, not with tension now, but with reflection, the kind of stillness that follows a truth too deeply rooted to argue with. Alexandria paused, her hands, until now steady at the podium, briefly lifted, palms open, a subtle shift. Let me tell you about my aunt, she said quietly, her voice carrying not through volume, but sincerity. Some leaned forward. Others blinked, surprised by the pivot. She taught third grade in the Bronx for 40 years, AOC continued. Not a private academy, not a charter, a small, underfunded public school off 138th Street in a building with radiators that clanged louder than the morning bell and hallways that smelled like pencil shavings and chipped paint. A tiny smile played at her lips as she spoke, the smile of memory, of love wrapped in exhaustion. Her name is Teresa, but everyone called her Miss T. Even the kids who saw her at the corner bodega on weekends would shout, "Miss T," like she never left the classroom. People chuckled softly, even a few Republicans. She believed in order, in eye contact, in teaching history with both the good and the ugly. She kept a jar of Jolly Ranchers on her desk, not for bribes, but for comfort. "Learning's easier when your mouth tastes like watermelon," she used to say. The smile faded. She gave everything to those kids, her knees, her weekends, her voice, which was loud, by the way. She once got written up for yelling over a broken intercom because she wouldn't let the class fall behind. She paused. And a few years ago, she started forgetting the kids' names. Now the hush returned, deeper, quieter, the kind of quiet that feels like reverence. At first, it was just the new students, AOC said, her voice softening, then her lesson plans, then the path home. Then one day, she held a pencil in her hand and stared at it like it was a foreign object. The same kind of pencil she'd taught hundreds of kids to hold. Her throat caught for just a moment. She swallowed, continued. She didn't know what to do with it. Someone in the back exhaled audibly. A journalist lowered her phone. "She's still here," Alexandria added. "Alive, breathing, smiling. But the woman who could name the favorite book of every child she ever taught is slowly becoming unreachable." She glanced up, meeting the gaze of the room. "I'm telling you this not to draw sympathy," she said, her spine straight, her voice clear again, "but to remind us what real service looks like. Real leadership. 40 years. No fame. No press conferences. Just one stubborn woman who refused to let poverty dictate a child's potential." Another pause. This one filled not with silence, but with meaning. "I think about her," she continued, "every time we talk about education as a talking point, a budget line, a campaign promise, because to her it wasn't political, it was personal." AOC's hand moved to her chest, briefly, reflexively, not posed. "I think about what we owe people like her, and I think about how easy it is, in rooms like this, in speeches like the one we just heard, to forget them, to flatten their life's work into anecdotes or applause lines." Now her tone sharpened slightly, not with anger, but with urgency. She doesn't remember her classroom anymore. Beat. But I do. Beat. And I won't let that memory be rewritten by those who talk of service without ever carrying its weight. The chamber was silent, not one cough, not one shuffle, only the faint hum of a nation listening. Alexandria didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words carried the same weight whether whispered or declared, and at this moment, the whisper cut deeper. "She's still alive," AOC said again, but people stopped seeing her long before the forgetting began. The room shifted, a rustle of suits, a shuffle of conscience. "At first it was subtle," she continued, "a slight delay in response, a patronizing smile, friends finishing her sentences as if they were helping, when they were really trying to hurry along a discomfort they didn't want to feel." She clasped her hands softly over the notebook. Then came the invitations that stopped coming, the phone calls that were forgotten, the moments where people didn't talk to her. They talked around her. AOC's gaze didn't harden. It deepened. "You know what hurts most about decline?" she asked gently. "It's not the memory loss. It's the loneliness." No one moved. Even the press gallery, usually twitchy with note-taking and digital tapping, was still. It's watching someone who once commanded a room now be treated like background noise. It's seeing how quickly society will decorate someone's legacy, as long as they stay silent enough to not challenge it. Her voice is still soft, turned iron-edged with truth. We love our elders when they're quiet, when they smile politely in family photos and don't ask hard questions. But when they fumble for a word or repeat themselves or forget a date, suddenly we shrink from them, as if their vulnerability is contagious. She paused and her breath hung in the air like glass. I remember one visit, she said. We were in the kitchen, and she was trying to tell me a story about one of her old students. She said his name 3 different ways, and my uncle, well-meaning I'm sure, chuckled and said, "Ah, here we go again." Her lips pressed together, holding back something raw, but when she spoke it was steady. She looked down, didn't finish the story, didn't try again. Now it wasn't just the women in the room dabbing their eyes. A male senator, known more for filibusters than feelings, turned away slightly in his chair. AOC inhaled, not shakily, but fully, like someone determined to carry the story forward even when it hurt. You want to know what real cruelty looks like? She asked. It's not yelling. It's not slander. It's not some angry tweet. Beat. It's erasure. Silence. It's when someone is still here, still breathing, still trying, and we decide they've outlived their usefulness. It's when we use decorum to justify neglect, when we cover dismissal with politeness, when we say she's not what she used to be, as if that means she no longer is anything at all. She let the thought hang, long enough to let it settle in the bones. Mocking decline doesn't show strength, she said softly. It reveals fear of it. There was a sharp stillness in that line, like air folding in on itself. The kind of truth that doesn't need amplification, only space. Because if we acknowledge what aging looks like, if we let ourselves really see it, we're forced to confront what's waiting for all of us. And that's terrifying. She leaned slightly forward, but fear is never an excuse for cruelty. Even now, even here, she never once raised her voice. But the force of her delivery, the steadiness of it, landed heavier than any shout could have. She is not a cautionary tale, Alexandria said, her tone lifting slightly at the edges. She is a chapter, still being written, and she deserves to be read, not erased. Someone sniffled. Another cleared their throat too loudly. But no one dared speak, because in that moment, everyone in that room thought of someone, a parent, a mentor, a neighbor, who had been left behind not by time, but by people too uncomfortable to sit with time's shadow. And Alexandria? She had just placed that shadow on the table, gently, bravely, for all to see. Alexandria let the silence linger one last time, not for effect, for impact. Then her voice returned, calm but carved from stone. We talk often in this chamber about what we're teaching the next generation. Her fingers lightly touched the closed notebook before her, as if anchoring herself to its weight, not just of paper, but of memory. We pass bills about school safety, about internet civility, about the moral compass of our classrooms. She looked out, not at any one person, but into the space just above the room, as if she were speaking to the children watching from living rooms, from civics classes, from hospital beds. So let me be very clear, she said, voice now like silk wrapped around steel. When you weaponize memory loss, when you turn aging into an applause line or paint forgetfulness as failure, you teach children something. A pause, a hush rippled through the gallery like a collective intake of breath before a fall. You teach them, she said slowly, that compassion is optional. The words didn't explode. They landed, heavy, inarguable. From the press gallery, a quiet gasp escaped someone's throat, a sound too quick to stop and too human to ignore. Melania, seated just behind a marble pillar, didn't shift, but her posture told its own story. Upright, elegant, yet unmistakably rigid, as if bracing against something invisible but real. AOC didn't press the moment. She didn't smirk. She didn't glance back. She simply let the silence and the truth do what it came to do. Draw a line in the sand, and let America decide which side to stand on. It didn't take long. By the time Alexandria had stepped down from the podium and disappeared into the corridor, the tremors had already begun. Phones buzzed, thumbs scrambled, screens lit up in every corner of the Capitol and beyond. On Twitter, now rebranded as X. The hashtags exploded like brushfire. Hashtag AOC responds. Hashtag words echo. Hashtag dignity. Defined clips of the speech surfaced within minutes, captured from 3 different angles. The line: "When you weaponize memory loss, you teach kids that compassion is optional," was already overlaid on black and white stills, looped into reels, even stitched into TikToks by teenagers who had never watched C-SPAN in their lives. The mainstream networks split, but not as sharply as usual. MSNBC's evening banner read, "A rhetorical masterclass." Ocasio-Cortez changes the rules of engagement. Fox's 8 p.m. commentator quipped, not without a note of respect, "She didn't yell, she didn't bend, and she still won." Cable news ran simultaneous panels dissecting her tone, her restraint, her refusal to name names, and how somehow that made the impact even more seismic. CNN called it a new kind of takedown. NPR called it an elegy in real time. But it wasn't just pundits. High school students shared the clip with captions like, "This is how you debate without destroying yourself." Teachers reshared the story of Miss T. And for one quiet hour in the American internet's lifespan, the noise made room for something rare: stillness, reflection, and maybe, just maybe, respect. The silence inside Melania's private holding room was heavier than marble. Her aides, usually quick to spin or salvage, sat glued to their phones, not to prepare rebuttals, but to monitor the wildfire they hadn't predicted. Then, like an unexpected crack in polished glass, one aide muttered without looking up, "We weren't ready for this kind of response." An hour later, internal communications began to leak, not through whistleblowers, but through quiet resignation. One memo, now circling private GOP group chats, simply read, "She didn't react. She maneuvered." Meanwhile, beyond the echoing halls of Capitol Hill, the speech took on a second life. Debate teams in Des Moines and Denver paused mid-practice to stream the full clip. HR trainers at major firms forwarded links in company-wide emails. A professor at Yale Law rewrote his syllabus in real time. This is no longer just rhetoric, it's case law in dignity. And across the aisle in a Fox News green room, a seasoned Republican strategist leaned back, shook his head slightly, and told a younger colleague, "She didn't just respond, she redefined the terrain." For all the planning, for all the precision put into Melania's appearance, none of it accounted for what happens when grace refuses to flinch. And in that refusal, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had done what few politicians ever do. She hadn't won the room. She had reset the rules. The flood didn't come through headlines or retweets this time. It came through paper, handwritten, typed in courier font, some decorated with dried lavender petals, others sealed in plain white envelopes. Alexandria's office mailbox overflowed within days. There were letters from nurses, one from a woman in Kansas who said she'd held the hands of dementia patients for 15 years and never once had a politician spoken about them without pity or policy. There were messages from retired teachers, like one from Alabama who wrote in blue ink, "We gave them our minds. We gave them our knees. Thank you for seeing what's left when the chalk dust settles." There was a card from a caregiver in Detroit. No return address, just a single line. "It was the first time my mother nodded at the TV in months." But one letter, soft beige envelope, cursive slanted with age, landed different. "I'm 62, it began. I've been silent for decades. At work, in meetings, at the dinner table. I've made myself small so others could feel tall." She went on to describe raising 3 kids, 2 layoffs, and a husband who believed dignity was earned through silence, not speech. Then the final lines. "But today I spoke up. Because of you. I said my piece at church. My hand shook, but I said it. I said, kindness isn't weakness, and forgetting doesn't make you useless." AOC folded the letter gently. No fanfare. No Instagram post. Just a breath. And for once, it wasn't the mic that stayed on. It was the echo. 14 months had passed. The news cycle had churned, pivoted, and spun itself dizzy. The internet had moved on, mostly, but not everyone had. It was a Tuesday when the message arrived. A slim envelope, no watermark, no fanfare, hand-delivered to AOC's office. Not by courier, but by someone she hadn't seen in over a year. Helena, former communications aide to Melania Trump. Alexandria blinked when she saw her. Helena gave a polite nod, no smile, just quiet gravity. Inside the envelope was a simple note, typed, no signature, but unmistakable in tone. It's time, not for cameras, not for speeches, just a table, a conversation. I'm listening. No letterhead, but Alexandria didn't need one. She knew exactly who wrote it. She sat with it for a long time. The aide who had handed it to her waited in respectful silence, then added softly, "She doesn't want a press release. She wants to talk about building a joint framework. On digital civility, she says." She never expected to learn from that day, but she did. The room was quiet, just the hum of old radiators and the distant murmur of Capitol Hill traffic. AOC didn't respond right away. She didn't nod. She didn't scoff. She just looked at the paper, as if listening to something that wasn't written there. Finally, after a beat, she folded it once, placed it on her desk, then looked up. "Tell her I'll meet," she said, "but not to negotiate terms." The aide tilted her head, unsure. "Then, what?" Alexandria stood, already reaching for her coat. "To find out if this is real." And for the first time since that unforgettable afternoon, two names no one expected to share a sentence were about to share a table. The library was quiet, not just because it was closed to the public that day, but because it had the kind of silence born from heavy architecture in older books. Columns held up the ceiling like watchful sentinels. Dust floated in golden shafts of light that cut through high windows. Melania arrived first. No entourage, just a single aide waiting outside in the car. She wore a gray coat, no brooch, no designer label visible. As if, for once, she wanted her words to be the most expensive thing in the room. Alexandria entered minutes later, alone. A cardigan tucked under her arm, a notebook in her hand, but no agenda written inside. They sat at a reading table deep in the center wing. Between them, a pitcher of water, 2 glasses, and nearly 2 years of unspoken wait. Melania's voice, when it came, was softer than AOC remembered, less poised, more real. "I let someone write my ending for me that day," she said, eyes not meeting Alexandria's. "The words weren't all mine. The tone wasn't mine. But the silence afterward, that was." She paused, adjusted a napkin that didn't need adjusting. "I want to write the next chapter myself." AOC didn't nod, didn't forgive. She listened, fully, then leaned forward, elbows on the table. "I don't believe in redemption arcs for PR," she said, "but I believe in legacy. If this is about ego, it'll die in a headline. If it's about kids..." Melania looked up, this time meeting her gaze. Then came the response. Clean, unscripted, sharp like sunlight. "Then let's write something the kids can actually use." Outside, someone walked past the windows. A young girl in a backpack, eyes locked on a phone. Neither woman turned, but both smiled. Because maybe, just maybe, that was the first line. They called it Project Echo. No press conference, no ribbon cutting. Just a quiet drop on a government education site, followed by a few social media posts from teachers and youth counselors. A new resource for classrooms navigating online life. No mention of Melania, no signature from AOC. But both their fingerprints were there, in every sentence. Project Echo was a digital curriculum for teenagers. It didn't lecture, it didn't punish, it asked questions. One module opened with a prompt. "When's the last time you regretted how you spoke online?" Another showed a side-by-side clip, one of a student mocking an old teacher via TikTok filters, the other of that same student reflecting in a video journal 6 months later after his grandmother developed Alzheimer's. The lessons weren't just about screens, they were about selves. Melania's contribution included a voiceover for a lesson titled "Before You Press Post." She didn't say who she was, but her accent, steady and slow, carried the words like pebbles dropped in water. "When we speak online, we leave prints. What do yours say about you?" Alexandria's segment appeared in a section called Interrupting Disrespect. Her tone was calm, even smiling. Calling someone out doesn't mean shouting them down. It means drawing the line, with language that leaves room for change. Teenagers across the country began resharing parts of the old confrontation, not as memes this time, but as stitched clips with commentary. This part hit different now that I'm in this program. Didn't think I'd learn from two women who barely said each other's names? Echo didn't go viral. It went quietly deep, into classrooms, into group chats, into dinner table conversations. Not everyone noticed, but those who did, they didn't forget. It didn't happen in headlines. It happened in rubrics. Across high schools in suburban Ohio, inner city Los Angeles, and rural Tennessee, a quiet line had appeared in speech and debate scoring sheets. Composure under challenge, 10 points. Students who once prided themselves on speed and volume were now taught to pause, breathe, and choose. Not just their word, but their tone. One instructor at a national debate camp in Vermont adjusted his curriculum entirely. In his opening lecture, he no longer referenced Churchill or MLK first. He clicked a remote, and on the projector appeared a still image from the Capitol 16 months earlier. AOC standing at the podium, eyes locked forward, lips barely parted. He pointed at it. "This," he said, "this is control. This is what wins without wounding." At universities, a term began to circulate, unprompted, unbranded, the AOC method. It wasn't about politics, it was about presence. Sociology majors wrote thesis papers dissecting how restraint, when intentional, could wield more power than outbursts. Communications departments hosted panels on narrative poise. Even student activist groups began training themselves not just in facts, but in framing. At MIT, a conflict resolution workshop added a final day simulation. What would you say if attacked publicly and you had just one sentence to change the room? Most failed the first time, but they kept trying. Meanwhile, in the corporate world, something curious began to happen. Internal HR decks, normally dry and full of bullet points, began citing a new case study. Grace under fire, the AOC example. One slide read, "When dignity responds to distortion, you don't need to raise your voice. You raise the bar." It wasn't about idolizing a figure. It was about modeling a choice. The choice to be unmoved, not because you're numb, but because you're anchored. A manager at a major tech company in Seattle rewrote their digital conduct manual. It ended with a single quote, "Words don't vanish, they echo." The phrase appeared on stickers on classroom walls in the bio sections of teacher Instagram pages. One bookstore in Vermont even painted it above their YA nonfiction shelf in cursive gold letters. It became more than a moment. It became a mirror. One people kept returning to, not to see Alexandria or Melania, but to see who they were becoming. And that was the real shift. Not in laws, not in party platforms, but in language, in how we now chose to carry it. It was a rainy Wednesday in D.C., the kind that made even the dome of the Capitol look gray. AOC had canceled all morning meetings. She sat alone in her apartment, legs folded beneath her on the couch, mug of mint tea in hand, the television on low volume. C-SPAN flickered on the screen, mostly out of habit. She didn't expect anything new. But then she heard her name. As Representative Ocasio-Cortez once said in this very chamber, the voice was young, firm with a melody that reminded her of someone, herself maybe, a decade ago. The camera panned to a woman no older than 30, dark curls, brown eyes full of intensity, a green blazer, no brooch, just conviction. Her name flashed below the screen. Representative Isabella Marin, Arizona's 3rd District. She stood at the center of the House floor, not clutching her notes, but holding them open like they were a letter she had carried for years. "I'm not here today to defend my right to speak," Representative Marin said, her voice clear. "I'm here to remind us why we must speak, even when we're dismissed, distorted, or interrupted." The chamber, half filled and half listening, began to turn. Marin continued. "In 2023, a woman stood here and said, 'Words don't vanish, they echo.' She didn't shout. She didn't shame. She showed us what strength looks like in silence. And because of her, I'm not afraid to stand here now." Alexandria froze. Her hand hovered near her lips. Her tea went cold. On screen, Maureen lifted her eyes toward the press gallery, as if speaking to someone unseen. She taught us that kindness is not weakness, that measured words are louder than tantrums, that dignity under fire is more revolutionary than rage. There was no applause in the chamber, but in AOC's apartment, a tear ran down her cheek, catching in the corner of her smile. She leaned forward, placing the cup gently on the coffee table, eyes never leaving the screen. And then, just above a whisper, barely audible even to herself, she said, "The words outlived me. That's all I ever wanted." No tweet, no press release, just legacy, doing what legacy was always meant to do. Continue. Voiceover begins. Software unhurried. The kind of voice that sounds like it's not trying to convince you. Just remind you of what you already knew deep down. In a world that demands performance, she chose presence. Cut to AOC standing alone at the back of a high school auditorium, watching a group of teenagers perform a scene they wrote themselves. A reenactment of the Capitol moment. No names spoken, no politics attached. Just tone, posture, breath. The young girl playing her doesn't raise her voice once. She just stands still. In a room full of noise, she didn't shout. Fade into Melania at a quiet community center, helping a nervous teenage boy draft his first speech. He's wearing a hoodie and wringing his hands. She slides him a small card with 3 words in italic print. Pause. Choose. Speak. He looks at her. She nods once, and he begins. She showed us how to echo without yelling, and how dignity, once demonstrated, never fades. Montage unfolds. A group of elementary students passing around printed sheets titled Digital Dignity, Echo Jr. One raises her hand and says, "My cousin posts angry stuff, but I think maybe he's just scared." Cut to a corporate boardroom. A conflict between 2 executives de-escalates, not through an apology, but through a silence long enough to hear something change. Cut to a church youth group sharing the moment when a quiet student finally interrupts a bully. Not with an insult, but with a steady, "We don't talk like that here." Cut to an elderly woman with early dementia, holding her granddaughter's face and whispering, "Thank you for slowing down." I felt seen. The voiceover continues, not louder, just deeper. She didn't win a debate. She changed the debate itself. Flashback one last time, that moment in the Capitol. Melania finishes her speech. The darted words, the flicker of eyes, the chuckles from the right, the stillness on the left. Then Alexandria rises. No paper in hand, no anger in voice, only presence. And now that still image, her at the podium, fades to black and white. But the echo remains. She taught us that control isn't power, it's restraint. That silence isn't weakness, it's strategy. That strength doesn't always enter with a roar. Sometimes, it simply refuses to leave. Final image, a simple classroom wall. On it, a poster. No face, just the words. Words don't vanish, they echo. The bell rings. Kids pack up. A young girl stays behind, glancing once more at the quote. She traces the word echo with her finger, then smiles. Not because she understood it fully, but because something inside her did. Voiceover closes. Whisper now, like a final breath. And in that echo, she's still speaking. This story isn't just about AOC or Melania. It's about the power of restraint in a world that rewards outrage. It reminds us that dignity isn't passive. It's a decision made in the middle of chaos. When someone chooses presence over performance, they don't just protect their voice, they elevate the entire conversation. Project Echo may be fictional, but its message is real. How we speak shapes how we're remembered, and sometimes the softest words leave the deepest marks. Question for the audience. Have you ever held back from saying something loud and found your silence spoke louder instead? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.